Chapter 8. Israel had too many female soldiers, or at least they did in 1993 when I joined. There were so many of us and we weren't really needed. We were excluded from doing any combat in case we became prisoners of war and got raped. I was thankful for that. I didn't feel the need to prove myself. I just wanted to do my 2 years and get out. My 3 weeks in basic training had removed any glow I might have about the Army. It was harsh, brutal, and brought out the ugly side of humanity. I didn't want to engage with it. I would do my required service and then leave. The base that I was assigned to was the main Air Force medical base. It was very small and quite fancy. I was relieved to be in an aesthetically pleasing place. I knew from my 3 weeks of the Army that I shouldn't take that for granted. We had the top doctors and surgeons of Israel come and do their month of Army service with us. It's compulsory for every man in Israel to keep doing that every year for the rest of their working life. It meant that I got to meet some very interesting people. I didn't have any office since my role was to be the communication point between the U.S. Air Force and the Israeli Air Force. They were working on a project together that had to do with pilots and their health. They had me use the library as my working space, and I didn't mind. It meant that I had a constant stream of visitors throughout the day, and we would sit and chat about their latest cases, or I would help them with their research. This was all done without computers, so it was a very slow system, and my help was really appreciated. It also meant that in my spare time, I could read through medical journals and find out interesting facts. Like if you needed to get maggots out of deep wounds, the best way to do it is to put a strip of bacon over the opening, and the maggots would slither out by themselves. How else would I gather this sort of useful information if it wasn't for my hours of private research in the medical library? I made a point of remembering the bacon trick in case I needed it while saving souls in the Solomon Islands. As it turned out, the pilot study was running out of funding, and my role got suspended. And as they waited for more money to be donated, I now had more spare time to fill up. I brought my Bible along to the base, and I would often sit there and read and take notes. Of course, hiding my Bible as soon as a doctor would come into the library. I really enjoyed my time with the doctors and surgeons, and they seemed to enjoy my company as well, often bringing their cup of coffee in during their break to chat with me. The base was outside Tel Aviv, a couple of hours of travel from Jerusalem on 3 different buses. It was a long way to commute every morning and evening 6 days a week. Though it did give me 4 hours a day of thinking time, which was great because I was able to perfect the love story that I had been working on since I was a child. I had added so many extra details and tweaks over the years. The daily commute was exhausting though. After about a month on the base, I was introduced to the medical commander of the Air Force. He had the most important role on our base and was a very respected man. We hit it off straight away. He was British and softly spoken, and he was intrigued by the fact that I had gone to a British school in Jerusalem. I asked if he was familiar with it, and he was. It turned out that he was a Jerusalemite as well, and after a bit more chatting, we realized that we only lived about a 5-minute walk from each other. Everyone else in the base came from Tel Aviv. He told me that he had a personal driver, and if I could be at his house every morning by 6:30 a.m., I'd be able to go with him in his luxury car. I was having to leave earlier than that to make it to the base by 8 a.m., so I was of course very happy to take him up on the offer. I was already a bit of an enigma at the base, with me sitting in the library, chatting away to all the doctors, and now I was arriving most mornings in a luxury car with the commander of the base. No one seemed to be able to quite understand my status. It was during this time that I got to know one of the doctors quite well. She was very kind and enjoyed practicing her English with me. She discreetly asked me one day if I had considered having a breast reduction. I tried to remain neutral as I answered, and not show her that talking about my body was beyond shameful to me. I explained to her that I had thought about it, but I wasn't quite sure how to go about it. I didn't have the money for the surgery, and it would be a very long waiting list. She explained that she knew all the top surgeons in Israel, and that she could write out a referral for me right there and then, and have me see someone within the week. She was true to her word, and she left me with a letter addressed to her friend. It was my first time to experience what Israelis refer to as protectia. It's all about who you know. Within a week, I was contacted and asked to come into the main hospital in Israel. I sat in the waiting room and looked around and knew that I had come to the right place. We all had giant bosoms. I was about 30 years younger than everyone else in the room and one of the biggest. When I was called in to see the doctors, I didn't even have a chance to take my jacket off before the three doctors in the room all nodded to each other and started writing on their notepads. My procedure was approved. They could all tell that I needed the surgery while I was fully dressed. What a relief. The thought of having to undress in front of anyone was really too much to process. About a month later, I was given the date for my surgery. I was to arrive at the hospital the day before and have the preparations done. I decided that ignorance was bliss and that there was no need for me to know anything about the procedure. I just wanted it done. I wanted the chronic pain in my back to go away and the sores on my shoulders from the bra straps to heal. I wanted to be able to wear a uniform without the buttons popping open at the most inappropriate times. I pretty much just wanted my breasts gone. I met with a surgeon who had to take lots of measurements and draw with a marker on my skin. I tried to force my mind elsewhere as he drew lines on me, and thankfully the moment passed without me fainting from the shame. He asked me a few questions. Was I aware that this surgery would mean that I possibly couldn't breastfeed my babies? Yes, I knew that. In that moment, getting rid of my breast was a matter of survival. It truly felt that if I didn't have them cut off, I might lose my will to live. The pain was so intense by this point that I would often cry myself to sleep. I was becoming more hunched and my shoulders were freezing up from the weight. The hours of traveling I had to do only made things worse. There was never a comfortable position to sit in. I would have to twist my body to such an unnatural angle to accommodate my massive breast. When I sat in a car or bus, that my hips were inflamed from the twisting. Breastfeeding to me was not my priority. I had to have these breasts removed. If I ever did have babies, which would be a miracle in itself because it would mean conception without being seen or touched by a man, they might just need to get their milk from elsewhere. I was fine with that. The next morning, my mother dropped me off at the hospital very early, and I waved goodbye from the parking lot. Not once did I think about asking her to stay with me. I had no fear, no trepidation. I just knew that I had to do this in order to be set free. The surgery went ahead as planned, and I was wheeled out into the recovery room. Once that initial adjustment of waking up from surgery took place, I was totally fine. Despite all the bandages around my torso, I felt as if the weight of the world was gone. My shoulders already felt better. My neck felt free, as if a lead jacket had been removed. I had tubes poking out either side of me, but I felt fantastic. The lightness in my body was so new and intoxicating. My body healed really quickly. Within a couple of days, I was back home. I hardly touched the painkillers that I was given. I was so grateful at how well my body was handling the surgery. No one besides my mother, and I assume my father, knew about the surgery. It was a complete secret, and I had yet to figure out how to explain to my friends what had happened to my giant breast. Besides the constant comments from men on the street, nothing was ever said about the size of my boobs. Friends must have known how embarrassed I was by my body, so it was a taboo topic that never came up. The Air Force doctor who had helped me with organizing the surgery so quickly hadn't stopped that. She continued to be my advocate, and through her connections, she made sure that I had over a month at home to heal and rest. She then managed to have me transferred to another military base so that I didn't have to return to where I had been stationed and face the humiliation of everyone's comments and questions. She knew that I drew a lot of attention already and that the men found my body a point of interest. I had told her about my guard duty experience. We only had to do guard duty about once a month. This meant that instead of being able to go home for the night, we had to stay and do a couple of shifts instead. A male and female soldier were paired together for safety. We had to change out of our beige uniforms and into the olive green fatigues. With our Uzis strapped to our backs, we would walk around the fence of the base for 2 hours, checking gates and doorways, checking under cars, making sure that the base was safe and no one had infiltrated. It was during one of these middle-of-the-night shifts that I was walking along in silence with my male counterpart. I never really felt comfortable talking to the guys on these shifts. I could feel their fascination and their long looks. It was best to just remain as neutral as possible and get the shift done, and then lock myself in one of the doctor's room and try and get some sleep until the next shift. As we were finishing our 2 hours of pacing around the base, the young man turned to me and asked me where I would be sleeping that night. I tried to ignore his question. He asked me again. He finally turned to me, and in that typical Israeli male stance, where it's really as if they're talking through their pelvis with their hips jutted forward as they speak, he said in his broken English, "You know, you would make a very good mattress." That night, I not only slept with the doctor's door locked, but I pushed the metal examination bed that I slept on in front of the door and had my Uzi nestled between my legs. With my now acceptably sized boobs, I showed up at my new base over a month later. It was a top secret, closed base in the middle of the desert. This would mean that we could only go home every 2 weeks for one night. I didn't mind. It meant much less traveling back and forth, which I was pretty exhausted from. My new role was to be the secretary for the commander of the pilot school. Me? As secretary? That was just hilarious. I couldn't even pronounce the word for secretary in Hebrew, kidah. The P and the K together made it one of the Hebrew sounds that I struggled to pronounce. I dreaded being asked what role I had. How was I going to explain it without being able to pronounce it? I was also possibly the most disorganized person on the planet. I had never had a healthy relationship with paperwork, and to think that I would be entrusted with a whole pilot school was beyond my comprehension. My previous role in the library had been mainly keeping doctors occupied during their coffee breaks and doing the occasional research. This was new territory. I tried to settle into my new role and not draw any attention to the fact that I was totally out of my depth. Thankfully, the girls in the office were incredibly kind to me, especially Neela. While she had her own tasks to complete, she also did mine. She answered my phone calls, wrote out reports, filed things away. I, in turn, decided that the office could do with a makeover, and I began drawing cows and sunflowers on every object in the room. Nothing was spared. Thankfully, the commander remained quiet about his quirky and useless secretary. He seemed to like the new look in his office and commented on my drawing skills. He was not only the commander of the pilot school, he was also the commander for the aerobatics unit and in charge of the fighter planes doing their tricks in the sky for special events. He asked me if I could help him out with illustrations. He needed drawings that showed when and where the planes needed to turn and twist and at what time. Finally, something I could do. I spent hours drawing designs, adding tiny details to the drawings, and really enjoying the challenge of making sure all the times were right. I had no training whatsoever in this role, but I was good at it. Word spread and I was given some more things to illustrate. Covers for instruction books, maps, signs. It was fun and it kept me occupied while Neela did my actual job as a secretary. The Air Force Base was far from Jerusalem and there was no direct bus, and it was much quicker to hitchhike. We were encouraged not to because we were very close to Gaza. If I didn't hitchhike through there was a strong chance that I would miss the last bus once I got to Jerusalem. It was too risky missing the bus. When hitchhiking, I tried to be careful. I wouldn't get into just any car that stopped. I tried to get an idea of who the people in the car were before I hopped in. I still don't know how I managed to stay safe. The pilots on the base heard that I was hitchhiking and would try and give me rides into Beersheba, the closest city, as often as they could. It meant that a lot to me that they cared about my safety. My favorite pilot was Isidore. His family had fled Europe in the war and found safety in Sweden. He was raised there and then moved to Israel as a young adult. We would sit and speak in Swedish, and he would tell me stories of being a helicopter fighter pilot. He was so sweet, and having him drive me into Beersheba in his beat-up car with the windows down was something I looked forward to. Once I got home for the Sabbath, I would quickly get changed out of my uniform and rush off to my Friday night job. I really wasn't spending much time at home at all. I knew things were tough, and I knew my parents were struggling. The mood in the home was incredibly intense and toxic. Ezra was uncontrollable. His rage had surpassed that even of my dad. Abigail was a wreck. She was crying when I came back home for the weekend, so relieved to have me there. While she never really told me what was going on, I could see on her face that she was suffering. My parents were struggling as well. Their finances were not stretching to meet their basic needs. My father had been managing a bookstore in the old city for a few years by now. It had started as a tiny little shop tucked away behind David's Citadel inside Jaffa Gate. The bookstore was owned by Christ Church, the oldest Anglican church in the Middle East. It attracted thousands of visitors each year. As my dad took over the running of the shop, it started to expand. He had a knack for knowing what people wanted to buy. He ordered Christian books and music from around the world. He sold handmade jewelry made from olive wood in Bethlehem and silver from Nazareth. People loved coming into the shop to talk to my dad. He was caring and gentle and would offer to pray with anyone who stepped into his domain. This shop gave my dad the perfect platform to do what he loved doing the most, sharing the good news of Jesus to strangers. Throughout my whole life, I had to put up with my dad asking strangers where they were going to spend eternity. He would use any spare money he had on printing his own leaflets about Jesus. He printed small flyers that explained the gospel in simple terms. He would leave them on buses and hand them out to parking inspectors. Even his favorite pickle man at the Shook was given one. No one missed out. My dad was on a mission to get as many people as possible into heaven's gates. It was on the forefront of his mind at all times. Being the manager of a bookstore inside the old city meant that Dad had access to thousands of tourists from all over the world. He took his role very seriously and would often tell us about the encounters he had with people who were seeking the truth in their travels through Jerusalem. Unfortunately, though, the money my dad was earning wasn't covering the cost of a family of 8. There were constant expenses. My dad's monthly earnings didn't even cover the rent for our apartment. We lived by faith, or at least this is what my parents called it. Each month, we trusted that God would bring the money in to cover the rest. It was tense, to say the least, with some months better than others, but always tense. Miraculously, we never went without. My mother always had food on the table for her 600 kids. We devoured her meals and we would come back for seconds. She baked for us and not once did we miss out. Things were changing, though. I would come back from the base on the Friday, and instead of the usual Friday night chicken roasting in the oven, there would be potatoes or plain pasta to eat. Nothing else. No vegetables, no sauce, just pasta or potatoes or bread. This went on for weeks. We started to refer to this time as our beige phase. Money was tight, tighter than ever before. I could hear my parents whispering about it, and it was really stressful. Something had to change, and change soon. After about 10 weeks of this going on, my dad asked all of us kids to be home on a Saturday afternoon. This was unusual. It was very rare for us to be home at the same time. Our apartment was tiny, and us older kids liked to make ourselves scarce. Susanna avoided being home as much as possible. Raphael spent every spare moment from the army with his girlfriend. Me and Sam were with John. It was really only Ezra and Abigail who were home. We had no idea why our dad wanted to meet with us. We sat on the couch and waited for him to begin. He explained what we already knew, that our money had run out. We didn't have enough to keep going. I'm pretty sure that Raphael said that he had some to give to help out, but my dad didn't want it. He wanted us to call on God as a family and pray that God would provide for our needs. He explained that after 7 years of working in the bookstore, he had a sabbatical year coming up, and that he had applied to Bible school in Dallas, Texas. He wanted to fulfill his long-term dream of studying the Bible for a year, and he wanted to go there with my mother, Ezra, and Abigail. This felt a bit strange. I was 19 years old, and my parents wanted to leave home. I felt like it should be me making that announcement, not them. I could tell my dad was serious. His nostrils had already begun to flare, and he hadn't even started praying yet. This was going to be big. It was always awkward when my dad prayed. I hated it. It was so emotive, with his chest heaving and trying to catch his breath. It reminded me of when he would lose his temper and start raging at us. He eventually started to pray. I couldn't remember the last time we had prayed as a family. It felt like it was years ago. It probably was. My dad then went around the room and laid hands on each of us, from the oldest to the youngest. I was wishing it would finish soon. The next morning, I returned to my base. I was hoping that things would change for my family. I really felt bad for Ezra and Abigail having to eat beige food. Both me and Raphael were getting fed at our military bases. I had access to Air Force food, which was relatively good considering it was Army cooks making it. Sam was eating at friends' houses. Susanna was working in a cafe and had food there. It was really just Ezra and Abigail who were missing out, as well as my parents, of course. Early that Sunday afternoon, I got a call. It was from my mother. She'd never called me, so I knew something was up. She was excited and wanted to tell me something. Our aunt, my dad's sister, had called from America. She had transferred some money to us, a few $100s. My mother would be able to go to the market and buy fruit and vegetables, and we would have chicken that Friday night. It was such great news. I was grateful and said a little prayer of thanks as I hung up the phone. God hadn't forgotten about us. Our beige phase was over. About half an hour later, I got another call from my mother. This time she was breathless. She had just received a phone call from Leah, the lady who opened the door to the Jesus House all those years ago in Lund when my parents needed a place to stay. She didn't go into details, but there was a Swiss bank account that had been in her family for a long time. She needed to shut it down for some bizarre reason. I never quite understood, but something about druids tracking her down, and she needed to go into hiding. Anyways, the Swiss bank account needed to be emptied, and she decided she wanted our family to have the money in it. A huge sum, thousands and thousands of dollars. The money would cover all the debt that my parents had accumulated in the past few months. It would also cover the 1-year tuition for both my parents to study the Bible in Dallas. It would even cover airfares and living costs. Each of us older kids would receive $1,000 to help us now that we would continue living in Jerusalem without our parents. It was a lot to take in. I hung up the phone in a daze. For all his faults, my dad did seem to have a certain connection to above. His prayers had been answered pretty much within 24 hours. The move to the States happened without much warning for my parents. They quickly packed up the apartment with all our belongings. They were only going for a year. They would then return and have all their things in storage waiting for them, so there was no need to be that careful about what was left behind. Little did they know. Liz invited me to come and live with her family. They had a 1-bedroom apartment on their roof, and I could live in there. To say I was happy was an understatement. Their house was already my emotional home, and it felt so right to finally call it my own. As I collected my clothes off my bedroom floor and moved into my new home on the roof, I was still a bit stunned about how quickly everything had happened. The other big change that happened during this time was that I had let my sister help me out with a job that I had on the Sabbath. For the last 6 months, I had become what they were referred to as a Shabbat Goy, a Sabbath Gentile. I worked for one of the richest families in Jerusalem. They were New York Jews in the diamond industry. They had lavish Friday night meals for their families and numerous weekly guests. All their food was prepared by a kosher chef, but they needed someone to come in and make their food look beautiful and to present it nicely and create an atmosphere. I can't remember how I heard about this job, but I figured that with my blue eyes and blonde hair, no one needed to know that I was in fact Jewish myself, and I could pass as a Gentile and make some money on the Friday night. I would come home from my base and change out of my uniform into a long skirt and a long sleeve top. I would then walk the 20 minutes to their luxury home. Once there, I would go to work. I absolutely loved it. I had the most expensive and beautiful types of meat to work with. I spread out thin slices of ox tongue, jellied meats, and pâtés on platters. Lettuce leaves were used to soften the look. Murmur had taught me from a very young age how to make a rose from a tomato peel. The platters would have tomato roses scattered all around them. Sometimes I would add a lemon peel rose in the middle of a salad or sprinkle their cured meats with fresh herbs. I had everything I wanted at my disposal. Edible flowers were ordered in from a delicatessen in New York. No expense was spared. I had hours of feeling creative, playing with food, and making the platters look beautiful. At the end of the night, I would wash the dishes, endless amounts of dishes. From my many hours in Liz's kitchen, I was used to this, and I would occupy my time singing my favorite songs. It was a really enjoyable job, and I was getting paid huge amounts for my work. When I explained to the family that I had to shift to a new Air Force base, they were devastated. Their Friday night meals had become the talk of the town. Guests were coming into the kitchen to watch me make these tomato roses, and no one seemed to be able to get enough of it. I had women taking me aside in the kitchen, offering me more money if I was to come and work for them instead. I had no idea how much the Jewish women valued having the most beautiful Shabbat table. I told the family that I knew someone who was just as good as me with food decoration. They seemed skeptical. I was the ultimate, and surely there was no one else. I explained that my older sister knew everything that I did, plus so much more. I paled in her shadow. If anyone knew how to make something look beautiful, it was Susanna. Not only is she an artist, but she has such a knack for color and design. She would make their Sabbaths shine. And she did. I explained to her that she was not to mention the minor detail of us actually being Jewish. Susanna also knew how to cook, unlike me, who had no cooking skills whatsoever. I knew how to bake, but not cook. So now when there were extra guests, Susanna could quickly whip up some of her creations, and everyone loved it. The two of us sisters became a bit of a talking point in the very rich circles of the Diamond Jews, as they were called. Once I moved to my new base, I was only available to work every 2 weeks. The family didn't mind, and often me and Susanna got to work together. It was a lot more fun this way, and for the first time in my life, I got to see what it was like having a sister as a friend. She treated me with kindness and actually seemed to like me. It was very new, and I really enjoyed having an older sister that I could not just chat to and observe the lives of the rich and famous together with. Eventually, I got to work on Saturday mornings as well. There was another Diamond family, and they had watched me interact with their children on a Friday night. They had 11 children, 11 children who were convinced that they ruled the world, and their 3-year-old son was a handful. Every few seconds, Rachel, the mother, would call out at the top of her lungs, "Menachem! Menachem! Menachem! Come here right now!" This went on all night, and it made the evening incredibly unpleasant. At one stage, when I came in with another platter of fish and ox tongue, I walked over to Menachem and whispered something in his ear. He looked up at me and walked over to his mother. She was absolutely stunned. How had I done that? What magic powers did I have to be able to get Menachem to listen? My many hours with Jesse and Annika had paid off. I had never treated them like babies. They were people with their own personalities. We would chat, I would ask them questions, they would tell me about their life from their perspective. All I had done was gone up to Menachem and connected with him by whispering in his ear instead of yelling at him across a giant table full of strangers. Rachel was hooked. She wanted me. Could I please come and help her? I saw the desperation in her eyes. She was a powerful businesswoman, a force to be reckoned with, but she had no control over her children, and she wanted my help. Saturday mornings were my time for church, though. From 10 o'clock until about 12:30, I was at church every Saturday that I was home from the Air Force Base. I often led worship with Danya or would do a Bible reading. Chuck, Liz's husband, liked to ask me to do a mini sermon based on a verse that week. I really hated missing church. It was a time for me to recharge my batteries and to reconnect with my community. I would meet visitors from around the world, and I was often organizing some sort of fundraiser or event. I didn't like the idea of missing out on my Saturday mornings, but Rachel was desperate. I eventually told her that I would come on a Friday night when Susanna was working with the other family, and then I would come on Saturday mornings before and after church. She was thrilled, and she offered me even more money. I did this for a few months, doing kitchen chores on the Friday night and looking after her kids on the Saturday morning when her husband was at the synagogue. I would stand there in her kitchen, listening to the Sabbath rituals going on in the living room. I was so grateful that I wasn't religious. Unlike them, I had a personal relationship with Jesus. They were so trapped in their religion, not me. I had Jesus as my friend. I had Jesus as my lover. Jesus knew me and I knew him. These poor rich people, they had so much money, but they had nothing compared to me and what actually mattered, a relationship with my Creator. Something started to happen, though, as the weeks passed. A string started to unravel, a string that made me start questioning things that had been so black and white until then. Were these religious families really that different to my own weekly church service? They had their prayers and we had ours. They had songs and we had songs. Sure, our songs were about Jesus as a friend and Jesus as a lover and Jesus in this intimate relationship with us. But was he really? It's what I wanted and desired and what I had craved for since I was 7 years old. But was he? Where was the evidence? As I stood there doing the dishes, I realized that Jesus was pretty much a pretty pathetic lover, a silent type, distant. He didn't really return my calls. He played hard to get. Whoa, how had I not seen this before? How had I become so caught up in the songs that I hadn't realized that they didn't really reflect reality? The songs just expressed the truth that I desired. Now that I thought about it, Jesus had never actually stopped and noticed me. He'd never sought me out. My endless request of him meeting me had gone unanswered. I was just as religious as these people singing their prayers in the room outside the kitchen. I might not be wearing a headscarf or keep kosher, but I wasn't any different. And my church wasn't any different. We were just as stuck in our routines, repeating behavior week after week and thinking that this meant we had a relationship with God. Wow, these thoughts shook me to my core. I tried not to let them unravel too quickly, but I could feel them tugging at my heart. The money that I had made from these 2 jobs were tucked into my bedroom drawer. I never used it. My weeks were spent on the base, all expenses paid there. In the evenings, when everyone else would socialize and hang out, I would put on my shoes and go running down the long roads heading into the dark desert. The stars would shine in the cloudless sky, and I had kilometers of flat roads to run on. Not a car in sight, not a single person out. I knew that the base was completely fenced off away in the desert. I was safe. I could run, no men calling out to me, no one hassling me. It was just me, the road in front of me, and the endless starry sky. Every other weekend, I would work and then go to church and hang out with my friends. Once we could see 3 stars in the sky on the Saturday evening, it meant that the Sabbath was over, and we would head into town, and that never cost much. Maybe a slice of pizza, a burger at McDavid's, or a frozen yogurt. My money was starting to pile up. During this time, my brother Sam and I were getting really close. We hung out a lot together since we shared the same friends from our youth group. We could all sense a change coming. I was a bit older than everyone else, but they were now all about to graduate from high school, and we would go our separate ways. It was almost impossible to comprehend. We were such a tight group. Our friendship that had started many years earlier and cemented itself with John during the Gulf War was now coming to an end. All those summer camps, Easter camps, Feast of Tabernacles conferences, the adventures in nature with John, it was finishing up with the end of school, and John was finally getting married. Dahlia had come to her senses about this man who adored her for so long and who had not given up despite her not showing any interest. After years of waiting, John was getting married, and it signified an end of an era. Sam had his army service looming on the horizon, and he didn't want to go. He was scared of what it meant for him. He probably had a combat role ahead of him. It didn't suit his soft heart. I heard Sam talking to Danny about wanting to go to the States. He didn't have any money for it, but was hoping to go and visit our parents, Ezra and Abigail, before his army service. I decided to surprise him. At the time, he worked in my father's bookstore in the old city. I went to visit him one Friday afternoon. Sam was happy to see me, and even happier when I handed him a giant chocolate bar. We shared a love of chocolate. Something fell out when he opened the wrapper. It was an airplane ticket to America. Sam was shocked at my generosity. I was thrilled to make him so happy and to give my brother something I knew he so desperately wanted. And it really wasn't a sacrifice for me. I had a whole bunch of money stashed away that needed to be used. The word of my good deeds spread among the youth group. There was a buzz about what I had done for Sam. My friends Rachel and Sharon came up to me a few days later. They were so excited about what I had done for Sam that they wanted to do the same for Danny. They had a bit of money, but not enough. Would I be willing to help them out? Could I give some money so we could get Danny to fly with Sam to the States? This was too exciting. One ticket seemed crazy enough, but to buy 2 tickets was the best thing ever. Of course I was in. I had never seen money as something you hold on to. It was meant to be used and to be shared. Easy come, easy go. My money is your money and vice versa. We went and bought the ticket and tried to figure out the best way to give it to Danny. That night, we waited until about 2 a.m. We wrapped ourselves in white sheets, put tinsel in our hair, lit a candle each, and did our best impersonation of an angel. We snuck our way into Liz's apartment and entered Danny's room. We changed the lyrics of the song In the Still of the Night to be about us wanting Danny to join Sam in America. We then handed Danny his ticket. He looked more stunned than happy. He had no idea what had just happened and fell back asleep. We were on cloud 9, though. We felt so good about our gift and quickly started plotting who we could help out next. Generosity is contagious, and we had our first taste of what that really meant. Not long after that, John and Dahlia had their wedding, and only a few days later, it was time to say goodbye. It was the summer of 1994, and it felt like my heart was breaking. The hardest person in the youth group to say goodbye to was Micah. He was the one I figured I would lose contact with first. I knew he wouldn't keep in touch. Our friendship was over, and I cried so hard when he sang his goodbye song to the church. As I cross the threshold of life, I have to say goodbye to all of the times we had, and we leave these memories behind to face another time. I'll never forget you, my friend. His words resonated in my heart. All the people I had to say goodbye to over the years, the friendships that had ended, the missed opportunities to tell people how I felt, the constant knowledge that the friends were only there for a season. My heart was breaking, and I really felt as if the only way to survive was to lock my heart and to shut it down. It was either that or feeling the pain that seared through my body. It was the end of a very special era of my life, and I would never have that back.